We continue our walk through the book of Genesis. Sometimes we skip a lot of chapters, and sometimes we skip fewer. And so, in the past, two chapters, which we've moved through, roughly about two chapters worth, Isaac has been born. Isaac was born, and as we heard last week, then, excuse me, that Sarah sees Ishmael, Abraham's firstborn, playing with Isaac, Sarah's firstborn, whom she's had with Abraham as well. And the kids, in fact, Ishmael is making Isaac laugh, which is his name, one who laughs. And she becomes very jealous of this and sends off Ishmael. And so now that happened right before this story. And now God says to Abraham, now that Ishmael has been sent off with his mother, a young teenager, now it appears that God is telling Abraham to sacrifice. In the Hebrew, it says only son. But other translations took the liberty of changing only to favored, because, in fact, we know Isaac is not Abraham's only son. Abraham just sent one of his two sons off. So I can't imagine as a father. Now, let me point out to you that the Canaanites, this is where Abraham's living, right? Modern day Israel. The Canaanites in that region had a tradition of human sacrifice to appease the gods. Other cultures did this as well, but this is happening in this region where Abraham is living. And so this is the context. So within that context, a God asking you to sacrifice your child, while it's really foreign and a difficult story for us to hear in 2020, and I think for most of the modern history, it was not at this time unusual for someone to hear a God say this. So Abraham's hearing from his God what everyone around him is hearing from God's. You must sacrifice your child, in particular a son or a daughter, but in this case a son, for me. If you're struggling with that part of the story, you can join the club. I am too. I mean, there's all sorts of theological explanations for this, but it's difficult. It's a difficult passage. But I still think that if we kind of move past this, that we might be able to learn something from this that is relevant to us today. The first thing that's interesting is that right there at the beginning, he says, take your only son Isaac, whom you love. We're 22 chapters into Genesis, and this is the first time the word love is used. Whom you love. And I think there's a reason it appears here first. Before, there's no mention of love between Abraham and Sarah. There's no love mentioned between Adam and Eve, or Noah and his wife, or Noah and his children, or others. But here is the first mention of love in the Bible. And with this mention of love, then comes this sacrifice. So this mountain where they're going, tradition tells us, is on one of the mountains, the mountain, the main hill in Jerusalem. And so to give you context for that, this is where the tradition tells us that the temples were built, where sacrifices would continue to be made to God by the Jewish people. And so Abraham heads out with these servants. And we see Abraham kind of deflect a question but in some ways maybe ironically deflected, where he says when Isaac, the one who laughs, asks, where's the burnt lamb offering? And Abraham says, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. We put a comma there, but maybe it could be a dash. Isaac realizes something's up. Again, he's grown up in a land in which children are sacrificed. So it's conceivable that this is going through Isaac's mind. Am I going to be sacrificed today? Is that why we don't have a lamb? I mean, he knew something was up to ask this question. This is a terrible situation, right? So they go through the act. Abraham goes through the act of building the fire. He sets up this altar for sacrifice and is right about to kill. And this word to kill his son, to kill, is the word that you use typically in Scripture for killing an animal, not a human. So it's not murder, it's to kill an animal. And then an angel appears, just like he did for Ishmael. At this moment of crisis, an angel appears to Abraham. And Abraham responds with, "Here I am," when his name is called out. A phrase that we're going to hear over and over again as we continue in the story of the Scriptures, this response, "Here I am." But there's something in that, "Here I am," I think. Because while the humans always say, "Here I am," God, the only name really that God gives for the divine, for himself, is I am. I am. So that when Jesus uses those I am statements in John's gospel as they're recorded, people at that time know what he's talking about. I am. So I can't help but to think that when someone in Scripture says, "Here I am," there's a bit of a recognition that they have the God stuff in them. Not that they're thinking of themselves as a God, but they were made in the image and likeness. And so when you respond to God with, "Here I am," when you respond to "I am" with, "Here I am," there's this reflection back to the divine. And the angel thankfully says, "Don't lay a hand on this child. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." And then, of course, a ram comes about. And what continues that we didn't read today, that in the following 3 verses, is that the angel appears a second time after the sacrifice and makes another promise. This is the 7th promise that God makes to Abraham, to bless him, and for that many people to descend from him, and for a nation to descend from him. What's interesting about this one, though, this promise, is the other 6 promises that God makes to Abraham. It's not because Abraham's done anything. There's no test that Abraham passes. It's a free grace, so to speak. But this one is in response to something that Abraham has done. This kind of makes me think about one of our small groups that I've been joining in has just finished up Romans, which is written by St. Paul. And throughout St. Paul's writings, right, it's grace alone, it's grace alone. And we were going to do for the summer James, the book of James, for the rest of the summer, but we've decided in light of the events happening in our country that we're going to do Be a Bridge, which is a biblical and scriptural look at racial reconciliation. So the time's called for us to make a switch. But we were going to look at James because, right, if you know anything about Scripture, James says, yes, faith, but works do matter. And so I think of this 6 times of grace and 1 time in response to Abraham's actions that almost feel like we see that in the New Testament. 6 letters from St. Paul, or whatever they are exactly. This morning I'm not remembering completely off the top of my head, but let's say 6 letters at least from Paul with grace and grace alone. And this one letter, James, who says, but works do matter. Faithfulness matters. And there's a reward for that faithfulness. There's a reward for it. Because, of course, not only does he keep his son, but this then sets the pattern for Israel that they are not to participate in child sacrifices. This is one of those important steps, actually, in which I'll bet from our eyes a really kind of questionable way for God to teach this commandment. Maybe he could have just, delivered it from on high like he did the other commandments to Moses. But nevertheless, this is how it goes. It does make a quite interesting story. I can't imagine around a fireplace, fire pit, right? 3,000 years ago here in the story. As a child, you've got to be on the edge of your seat, right? And it's saying that the animal is just as sacred. The animal is just as sacred. And as a consequence, the sacrifice of the animal is just as sacred. What this lesson, I think, that it's trying to teach us is that we all have things that we highly prize. We hold so dear to us. And that God is asking us, will you put that aside even for me? But in fact, it doesn't mean that you're going to have to put it aside. But it does mean that we have to make certain things of less priority in our lives so that God may be the most important thing. And then trusting that when we do that, that there are the promises of God. While God's grace covers us, and all of us, and is given to us freely, there are both spiritual and earthly benefits of following the way of God. Traditionally, Scripture calls this wisdom, right? Holy living. I think of the story of when I was beginning the ordination process, and was in discernment group. And if you're not familiar with this, the diocese appoints about 4 or 5 folks. In my case, some came from Annunciation, some knew me less, and while they were at Annunciation, they were new to Annunciation, because by that point I'd been in Annunciation for a couple of years. So we would meet once a month, and we read a book, but there were these wonderful questions and conversations that we would have. And I can remember one evening being asked, what was the one thing that was really seemingly stopping me from saying yes? Because as much as I had said that I wanted to do this, I still had not been willing to take some of the steps, like go to seminary, to make it happen. And I broke down in tears. And I still get a little teary when I think about it, that I said, I don't want to lose my children to the church. I love being a dad. I love it. And I love my children. And I don't think I can sacrifice my children as some clergy do on the altar of the church. I can't do it. But the time came in which I had to go off to seminary, and it didn't make sense for my family to move up there with me. And so for a year, I was going to be away from my children. And it was hard. It was so difficult. And they were younger, so I would call them. And, when they're really young, kids aren't great at conversation on the phone. It lasts about a minute and a half. With Bennett, my oldest, it would last 5 minutes, but still, it didn't last very long. And I missed them so much. And then someone suggested to me that I should read to them. And so I started reading How to Train Your Dragon and eventually Harry Potter. And we went chapter by chapter. And just about every day, I would call them. And we would read a chapter together. And what that meant was that when I came back, in fact, in some ways, because I'd been so busy rebuilding New Orleans before I went off to seminary, that I, in fact, unknowingly was sacrificing my children, not on the altar of the church, but on the altar of New Orleans. And so the irony of me trusting God and going off to seminary and seemingly going away from my family meant that an opportunity opened up, that the three of us spent an hour together just about every day for 365 days. I mean, if you think about it, in a normal life, we really carve out every day an hour for just our family? I mean, life gets busy. I'm not saying this to make you feel bad or blame you. That's between you and God, your household. But you know what I'm saying. And yet, because I was away, over FaceTime or Skype, we carved out an hour. And we became closer. And so when I came back, we kept doing that. We kept reading together. And it's this wonderful memory for all three of us. And we have jokes about it. Bennett was younger. He'd inevitably fall asleep, And Jackson would go, Dad. Bennett fell asleep again. Should we wait or keep going? You see what my point is, friends? Is that sometimes there are things that we think that we're making a sacrifice. And we keep saying no to God. And we keep saying no to God. Instead of trusting to God that when we say yes to the thing that God is inviting us to say yes to, that it's going to work out. That God is on our side. That in fact, God doesn't want to sacrifice in our sons and daughters. So what is it in your life that you keep holding on to? That you're just afraid to let go of and to put in the hands of God? That's what Abraham did in the story. He put Isaac, the one who laughs, in the hands of the Creator. Ask yourself today, ask yourself this week, are you really trusting God with your children, or are you controlling it? Are you trusting God with your vocation and your career? Are you trusting God with maybe your aging parents? Are you trusting God with your aging process yourself? If you're struggling with that, I'm going to just plug our third 30. That's going to come up this Friday at 6:30. Doesn't matter what church you belong to, everyone is welcome to that. And if you want to know more, you can reach out to me or Chris over at Mount Olivet. Are you fearing that? Ask yourselves this week, what is it that I'm afraid of putting in the hands of God? And say to God, I want to trust you. I want to trust you, God, that you have it best for me and for my family and for the people I love. Amen.